Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress. Chapter 6, Cordials. Cordials. The door to the room flung open, and Rultin hopped in with such a flourish, it reminded Ravsesa of a punctuated ending to one of Muthan's great theatrical comedies. "Meeting with Eindon is on," he declared gleefully, his arms outstretched as if welcoming the entire room to indulge in his charismatic presence. He slammed the door behind him and rubbed his hands together. "Wheelin' and dealin', that's what they calls it down in me old neighbourhood. You be right, Piecora. You'd be lost without me. I'm essential to the plot. Ha, ha. Ne'er in me life did I think for once I'd be good at this sort of thing." Ravsesa and Piecora were both sitting in two of the large upholstered chairs, still discussing the possible ramifications and the improbable odds that their hostess was a Callistico, which they learned the night before. As the late evening approached, they, along with Ortor, had just eaten their supper-time meals of mead caramelized seasoned lamb cubes and spiced vegetable kebabs cooked over open flame, followed by a selection of breads and puddings, and each contributed to the depletion of a bottle of Enegraden wine. Relaxing after the delicious meal, they sat quietly exchanging hypotheticals at the ceiling about the hostess, Valesh Callistico, and how she might affect the situation here in the Bishop's Lament when Rultin's sudden entrance destroyed their post-dinner reflective peace. "By the gods, Rultin!" Piecora shouted, as the Xianjian nearly fell out of her chair. The exclamation was a surprisingly Canonian thing to say, and sounded very strange from a Xianjian. "Listen to me. I'm already talking like a Vdelkin bricklayer, thanks to you. Or should I say, ye?" Ravsesi felt her heart jump into her throat when Rultin entered, but otherwise she held her surprise much more in check than Piecora. Ortor, on the other hand, levitated from the bed nearly a hand's length without utilising a single muscle, and now he sat against the wall, palpitating while staring at the little man. She got up, sat next to him, and ran her hand through his ginger-red hair. She was used to him being so easily frightened. "Shh, it's just the little man, son," she said lightly. "Go be a lad and put a log on the fire and read one of the Canonian books over there to learn more of their words, or play with your rat-catcher toy. Imagine the rat is Rultin, and you're the catcher." Slowly he crawled over the bed, hopped down, and walked across the room to the hearth along the back wall where the embers needed rejuvenating. Ravsesa looked back at Rultin and shrugged her right shoulder. "Certainly, killing all three of us with your outburst could solve many issues at once, dear Rultin." Rultin looked pained at her sarcasm. "Ye jest, my lady, forgive an old lad for his excitement, but this be the thing that I wasn't sure I could do. The thing that be riding all on me to get it done, and here I am, ne'er met the guy in person, don't even know what he looks like, and I'm a-having a book dealer. What made me think I could have done this deed?" "Need is the tincture that loosens the hardened clay, as they say in Muth," said Ravsesa. "I knew we couldn't stay in Coast Haven, and coming to Alagost made the most sense. Naturally, only you could have arranged this meeting with Eindon. I do think you should give yourself a little more credit than you tend to allow yourself, Rultin. None of us could have done any of this without you. I think you're more capable than you think you deserve." Rultin flopped on the chair that Ravsesa sat in before he arrived, and plucked at the remains of food on her plate, while still luxuriating in his newly discovered talents. Piecora stood up, uncorked another bottle of wine, and poured 3 glasses. "When is the meeting, Rultin?" she asked. "Tonight," he said, leaning back in the chair. His feet dangled from the front of the chair like a child. "His Grace wants to meet you, Ravsesa." Ravsesa, taking a glass of wine from Piecora, paused and looked concerned. Why me? I don't think I should leave this room until it's time to leave the city, don't you?" She looked back and forth at Piecora and Rultin. "That be what the word is according to me sources," Rultin said. "What are your sources?" asked Piecora, handing him a glass of wine. "Well," As a friend of the rat in Coast Haven, I made myself known to the knives while in Knightsport, and this got me in to speak with old Julian Grey-Eye and Evellion. That be how we got the caravan together to get up the road safely the Allagost. That be also how I met with the Talons here in Allagost. I think that's through Evellion. She seems to be close with them. That be how we got put up in here in a bishop's lament. So now here we are, where all the rich and powerful congregate during the games like roaches on a silver plate. There be a Talon here in this establishment, and she arranged the meeting tween us and old Einden Vandus, be midnight tonight in a Senzadi room. Cordials, I believe, be the name. Senzadi? Asked Ravzizi. Old parlour game. Came with us from o'er the salt sea when we be Southrons long time ago, or an age, in fact. One of our oldest traditions, one of the few that we took with us from some faraway unknown land, one of the few that made it and survived. Midnight, said Piecora. That's when our hostess begins her shift. She introduced herself as a Callistico last night. Does she know about us? About anything? Why we're here? Not a clue, said Roltin, but fancy that luck, will ye? Ere I thought getting to the most elusive rich man in a country be something, I was just not up to the task for. And here we are with options, multiple options. We got a Callistico serving us. I couldn't have planned it better if I tried. Maybe you didn't, said Ravsez. Maybe it was the Talons or Evellion of the Knives that sent Valesh to us. Maybe, said Roltin. But that's some irony, ain't it? One of the old Callistico family, probably without 2 coins to scratch together, working here in a bishop's lament right under the nose of the man who tore it all down and ruined everything. That can't be the same man, said Ravsesa. You said this was ancient history, hundreds of years ago. Aye, 'tis. But the name still be the same, Einden Vandus. Maybe a figurehead, maybe a great-grandson, but he keeps out of the light, and they keep the name going on and on. I'd guess there've been people who tried to expose him, but his wealth protects him. Nobody's e'er found him out, not yet. When it was nearly midnight, Ravzizi, Piecora and Roltin left the room, shutting the door behind them. A lone figure stood by the window at the end of the hall. Roltin tossed him a few coins and said, Talons'll watch the room. Your boy's safe. They worked their way down the spiral stairs and through the cacophonous bedlam of the Bishop's Lament's many halls, weaving between tables and sliding through crowds of wealthy Canonians from every city and town in the country. Ravsez kept her hood over her head and her thin veil over her face, so that only her light pink goat's eyes and Silagan ink markings were visible from the shadow of her hood. Otherwise, she blended well with the crowds as an upper-class Canonian thanks to her experience with mansion life in Muth. Although their 2 cultures were vastly different, she found that the basic protocols of social etiquette were mostly similar. She followed Roltin as he swam between people's legs with ease. Piecora followed last, leaving behind her a wake of spilled drinks, annoyed expletives, and wounded pride. Finally they came upon the Senzadi room called Cordials. Several finely appointed and coordinated guards stood out from the door, creating a zoned perimeter around the door where people weren't allowed to enter. Roltin walked up to one of them and rapped on the guard's right brigandine cuissard with his knuckles. The sound made a metallic ring that immediately drew the guard's eyes down. "Oi! Let us through!" shouted Roltin over the surrounding crowd. "He be expecting us." All of the guards took notice, but soon they stepped aside and let the 3 of them into their perimeter. One of the guards banged on the reinforced wooden door with his metal gauntlet. A small window slid open at eye level with the guard from the other side, and the 2 exchanged hand gestures. Then bolts and latches were pulled from the other side of the door, and the heavy door finally pulled outward, but only far enough to allow Ravziz, Piecora and Roltin to enter one at a time. Inside, the room was brightly lit by crystal chandeliers hanging from the peak in the middle of the high, lofty ceiling. The large hall featured many arched windows of painted glass on the far wall. On the left side, upon a raised floor, rested a large circular table draped in fine linen, and covered with bottles of all shapes, sizes, colours and styles. A serving man waited by the table with a cloth over his arm, and another man rose from his seat to greet the guests. 2 armed guards stood on either side of the door they had just come through, and several others stood between the painted glass windows on the other side of the room. 2 more guards were posted by another door in the wall to the companion's right, on the opposite side of the room from the raised floor and circular table. Behind the table, hanging on the wall, was an enormous circular relief sculpture, flat on the other side where it was attached to the wall with heavy hooks. On its outer side was an ornate carving of what looked to Ravziz like the interior layout of a building, as viewed from above. Hollowed-out portions were rooms divided by walls and changes in elevation. She couldn't quite understand what kind of place it depicted, or even why it hung there at all in the first place, or what purpose it might serve. But then she realised that it reminded her of a tactical layout for military purposes. This came to her thanks to a visit to Veklische Mansion from a high-level military officer. She just happened to be tasked with clearing the room after they left, and saw a large map of some interior space she couldn't identify, with wooden markers and pins placed here and there. "It's a map," she heard herself say too loudly, and she immediately recoiled and stood behind Piecora. But that wasn't before she took notice of the man rising to his feet as they entered the room. His face was like sculpted wax, shiny and unblemished, pale and rosy around his nose and cheeks, with dark hair slicked back and tied behind his neck, with a wide silver bow that looked like a misplaced dinner napkin. His sharp, hooded eyes were the colour of wet slate that glistened in the rain, and his nose was a sharp, angular keel that held his face perfectly straight and symmetrical on his neck regardless of his body's animations, which seemed almost serpentine according to Ravziz's observations. His long black moustache curled upward into oiled points on either side of his face, and his black oiled goatee accentuated his chin and jawline with a dagger-like point that jutted down to his pronounced Adam's apple. His white, smooth shirt was trimmed in intricate silver and black filigree. The sleeves tapered tightly around his biceps by silver rings on each arm, before they billowed outward around his forearms and smooth, shiny hands like a gigantic lotus flower. The shirt was cinched at the waist by a narrow black leather belt, and below the belt, the shirt billowed outward around the man's thighs. Over this shirt, he wore a black velvet-padded vest, probably worth more than the carriage they rode to the Bishop's Lament when they first arrived. Tight, black breeches and high, soft leather boots covered his legs, along with a black codpiece ornamented with the harp and wave, Callistico device, ornately wrought in silver. "Friends!" the man called across the room, sweeping his arms wide. His high voice rang clear in the spacious hall. He briefly lost his balance and knocked over several drinks on the table, to which the servant with the towel immediately hustled over and started wiping up. Against the wall behind where the servant once stood, Ravzizi saw a pile of similar towels. Her training resurfaced so quickly and unexpectedly that she almost ran to the table, gathered the soiled towels, and then ran them off to the laundry cellar somewhere beneath the fortress, probably in the tunnel where they came from. In fact, she saw it all play out in her mind before her as she caught herself and stood frozen in mid-step. Somehow, miraculously, some hidden part of her refused her assumed orders. "Dear gods, he's drunk," mumbled Roltin. The 2 guards on either side of them exchanged glances. "Oh, my stars above and the world below, by the moons, please come in. Come, partake with me," said the man, slurring his words while leaning heavily on one arm braced on the table, the other bent at the hip theatrically. The way he moved reminded Ravzizi of a puppet whose limbs were controlled by an angry child. Then she wondered how Artor was doing back in the room upstairs. Roltin stepped forward and approached the table, saying, "Lord Einden Vandus, your grace, we are—" "What be your pleasure, Havener?" shouted Einden Vandus over Roltin. "Ah, I love that accent. I practice it sometimes. We have a sample of all the spirits provided by the good bishop right here." Eindon waved his arm grandiosely over the table, nearly taking out several bottles. His servant began hastily moving the bottles to the other side of the table, away from his master. Ralton stopped and fidgeted with his fingers. Perhaps a nip of the fairy, my lord, he said. Dirty, dirty. Oh, you dirty little mind, boomed Eindon. But I'll play your game. Mordiere, black absinthe for me and the dirty Havanna, shall we? Alan, my lord, said the servant. Eh? Responded Eindon quizzically. Alan, my name is Alan, my lord, said Alan the butler. You always forget my name when you've had too much. Perhaps it is time. Oh, you Brenzage all look alike to me, hissed Eindon at Alan the butler. Born and raised here in Alagost, my lord, said Alan the butler. We'll be 12 years serving you, my lord, next week. Shall I send for water? 2 black absinthes, you impostor, crooned Eindon, raising his hand straight in front of him with 2 fingers pointed at Alan the butler. We have guests. You're a butler. Do your job and butt away. Alan the butler began preparing the black absinthe on the other side of the table from Eindon. Ravzizi knew all too well the plight of Alan the butler, and it made her heart ache. The man's professionally calm and stoic treatment of his outrageous lord was truly something to admire. Ralton glanced back at Ravzizi and said, Whatever that man makes, don't let me drink it. No telling what. Come, sit. Let us get to business before we purge the bilge with pleasure, as they say. Ravzizi paused as she walked slowly toward the table, suddenly gripped with an icy fear on the back of her neck. That was a very Muthan thing to say, she thought to herself. Who is this man? Ralton sat at the table in front of Eindon, and Ravzizi sat behind Ralton. Piecora remained standing behind them both, glowering at the Canonian lord. Eindon gathered himself into a chair as if he were a wind-tossed curtain drifting weightlessly back to the ground. He reeked of hard spirits, enough to amaze Ravzizi that he was still conscious. Yet she saw no perspiration, nor any other sign of toxicity. What will the ladies have? He asked. A cider for the Sienjan? Tonic for the Muthan? Nothing, said Piecora, in a flat voice. But something in the way Eindon just spoke ignited Ravzizi somewhere deeply, and she threw back her hood and glared at him. I am not Muthan, she said grimly. For barely a fleeting moment she saw a pulse of shock dilation in his eyes, but then he immediately recuperated. Well, well, he said, tapping on a glass with his finger. It is true, then. She reveals herself with barely a prompt. Isn't that true, Mordiere? Alan, my lord. Alan. Your butler, said Alan the butler, while he manipulated the dark alchemical concoction known as black absinthe. My lord, said Ralton quickly, we come to ye in great need and peril. We had to come to ye ourselves. Coast Haven is no longer safe. The tapestry is compromised, its liberation routes are known by our enemies. We need to get Ravzizi and her son out of Canonia, east into the wildlands, with Piecora as their guide. 'Tis the only way. Eindon leaned back in his chair and nearly fell over before catching himself by the edge of the table. Yes, well, that's all very well and good then, he said as he stabilized himself. He looked as if he were counting numbers in his mind. Why bring this to me? Sounds like you have it all figured out. My lord, said Ralton, ye be a great friend to the tapestry. Ye've helped us stay going even when times were lean. Ye purchased the deed to Museus Antiquatum Endium on behalf of the Callistico family. Behalf, said Eindon suddenly, his face twisted in anger and his voice rising. I'm Callistico now! I am Callistico! I've been Callistico for hundreds of your filthy years! By gods be damned to the hells! My lord, said Alan the butler before Eindon could continue his outburst. May I present the black absinthe? Alan the butler placed 2 glass goblets before Ralton and Eindon, containing a liquid of black ink. A faint wisp of black smoke floated from the surface of the drinks, and Ravsez thought she noticed the air shimmering just above the goblets. Within the blackness of the drink, faint trails of a glowing green amorphous shape could barely be seen, as if some spirit lived within the liquid. "Thank you, Maudie," said Eindon, suddenly smiling again and leaning back in his chair while cradling the glass goblet in his hand. He smelled the black vapour of the drink. You can feel it in your hand through the glass. It murmurs like a distant stampede. You've outdone yourself, Maudie. Whatever made you suggest such a wicked potion, Havner?" Well, I didn't think he'd actually make it, my lord," Raltin answered. "'Twas simply the most absurd thing to come to my mind at the time." "Never underestimate the powers of Mordier the Great, sorcerer of the black arts of Brenz," said Eindon somberly, his words slurring into each other. "Really, my lord, I'm Alan, your butler," said Alan the butler. "I'm sending for water." Eindon dismissed him with a flamboyant wave of his hand. "My lord, I do not wish to indulge in Callistico family history, and from me standpoint, you're indeed Callistico through and through, soul, body and mind. And might I just say again how much we appreciate your patronage. You've made the museum a proud, safe place for people to visit, and for us to keep the Unscavia safe." There was a long moment when no one spoke until suddenly Eindon slapped the table with his hand and shouted, "Sens Ardi time!" He jumped up and walked over to the huge hanging relief carving. It was twice the size of the circular table. He ran his hands along its contours and said, "Ah, look at this truly magnificent Senzadi board. Gods, I have such a weak spot for ingenuity, especially human ingenuity. Not Muthan, not Canonian, but human. Shall I explain?" Raltin responded quickly, "My lord, I've played my share of Senzadi, but we really must—" Eindon cut him off as if he didn't hear him. "The name of the room is named after this particular Senzadi board. Cordials, it is, made over 100 years ago. You see here, this is a layout of the Palace of Alagost, the very seat of power itself." He began pointing out all of the rooms, halls and appointments, declaring each as being worth a certain number of points. When he finished, he reached into his vest and drew forth a black leather wallet containing 6 feathered darts. 3 had black feathers, and 3 had silver feathers. "Cordials?" he said while rounding the table with the wallet open. "It is more about the narrative that we weave than it is about points. Points. Gah, so barbaric. Let us instead tell a story with the game we play. Raltin, since you are familiar with Senzadi, choose your darts. Care not for the points. I'd like to see what guides your aim when you pierce the Palace of Alagost." Suddenly, with a breath of wind, a hatchet flew right between their faces and landed with a loud wood-cracking thunk into the very middle of the ornate Senzadi board. A split in the carved wood appeared above and below the beautiful Cynthian hatchet. The haft of the hatchet was wrapped in teal, blue and yellow leather. Its wide, elven, green-tinged metal blade drew to a point at the top, before curving gracefully down below the insertion point at the top of the haft. After several more loud, excruciating cracking and groaning sounds, the huge Senzadi board split vertically and fell to the floor in 2 equal halves, leaving the Cynthian axe stuck into the plaster wall behind. "Eindon," barked Piecora, while returning her throwing arm back to her side. "We need your money to fund an expedition into the wildlands, and we need it now. Now." Eindon walked back over to his beloved Senzadi board and looked down at the broken pieces. Ravsese discovered she wasn't breathing from the shock of Piecora's disruptive act, so she slowly began inhaling and exhaling in controlled measures. Raltin sat frozen like a statue, still facing where Eindon sat only moments ago. Eindon sighed heavily, then looked up at Piecora and said with a surprisingly droll flatness, "I'm taking that out of your allowance." Somehow this broke the spell over Raltin, and blinking wildly he looked at Eindon, then back at Piecora with a look of horror across his face. "What did you do?" he mouthed breathlessly at Piecora. "I am not here to drink," said Piecora, her voice simmering. "I am not here to talk. Either I get them into the wildlands, or they stay here and die. Choose." Ravsesi found that she wasn't breathing again, and discovered that it was simply the raw strength of the Xianjian's countenance, the sheer force of her will that it filled the room palpably and sucked the air right out of her lungs. Ravses had never been in the presence of someone like this before, and it made her head hurt and her mind swim. Eindon slowly turned, his head on an unnervingly perfect swivel, as he kept his steel eyes pinned unblinking at Piecora. "Now I see who really leads," he said. As he strode past Rultin, he bent down, held Rultin's large head with both hands, and kissed his forehead. "This is not over, old man. I shall have my game with you some day, and with the Black Fairy to guide us." He walked past Ravses without looking at her, and as he approached Piecora, he pulled something small from an inside pocket of his padded vest. It glittered metallically as he held it to Piecora in the palm of his hand. "My ring," he said. "'Tis not silver, 'tis not gold, 'tis not iron, nor is it bronze or copper, not even platinum from the Undying Lands. Do you know what it is?" Piecora didn't move, but glanced briefly at the ring with her eyes. "Then it is steel," she said finally. "Aye, steel," said Eindon. "Not the metal of gods, nor the metal of the Fae, but human metal. Steel. Take it." Piecora waited several more moments, looking down at the ring and then back at Eindon. Ravses felt as if the very winds bent their trajectories around this confrontation, as Eindon and Piecora vied against each other within the strain of their locked eyes. Finally, Piecora lifted the ring from his hand. Eindon clasped his hands behind his back and stood with his legs together. He said, "It will buy you everything that you need for your journey. Just show them my ring, spare no expense. Get whatever you can, hire whomever you must. Horse and bridle, armour and barding if necessary. You are the Xianjian guide, you know best. Keep the ring for whenever you are in this city, so that you will always be looked after." Piecora looked down at the ring with disgust on her face. She then tossed it dismissively at Ravsesi and said, "Don't lose that." Rultin bolted out of his chair and took Eindon's hand, saying, "Gods bless ye, Lord Eindon Vandus of the Callistico family. Your kindness be boundless to no end." Eindon bowed in response, then crossed the room to retrieve Piecora's hatchet while saying, "I bid you all then a good night. Guards, get the board up and we'll have it repaired in the morrow. Won't be the same, though. It's taken on new life after tonight." He came back to Piecora and handed her the Cynthian hatchet that was given to her on her previous adventure. "A fine axe this is," he said. "Fey metal, wrought by the Cynthian Eldar, I'll presume. Even now I find that hard to believe, even after feeling it in my own grasp. I thought they were gone forever." She took the weapon from him and slung it back into its holster on her belt. "They are not gone. They are rebuilding, even as we speak." "That is good news," Eindon said. "Wondrous news. Unbelievable news, in fact. I can only imagine the stories you must have, Xianjian." "I'm sure you'll try, Bricklayer," she responded, patting him heavily on the shoulder. Then she turned around and pushed the heavy door open, to the surprise of the guards outside. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.